So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the 2020 post-apocalyptic road trip movie Love and Monsters. And when I first heard about this movie, it was originally called Monster Problems. And when I read the plot synopsis to it, it made me roll my eyes because I didn't think the plot sounded all that good. But then at some point, the title was changed from Monster Problems to Love and Monsters. And the movie was originally supposed to be released in March of 2020, but due to the pandemic that occurred around that time period, the movie got delayed several times over the course of that year, and in between the time, the trailer was released. And I remember being pleasantly surprised by the trailer, because it actually looked like a fun creature feature. But eventually, Paramount decided to release the movie via video on demand, and since then the movie became this sleeper hit, which surprised me, because I wasn't expecting this movie to be such a hit with a lot of people, to a point that I remember seeing this movie show up on several top 10 movies of 2020 lists or videos, which leads me into my question: is Love and Monsters deserving of being this sleeper hit it became? As for the plot of the movie, sometime after the destruction of an asteroid, all cold-blooded animals ranging from reptiles to insects begin to mutate into large monsters because of the chemical fallout of the asteroid, which leads into the apocalypse. 7 years later, with most of mankind living in underground bunkers referred to as colonies, one of the survivors, Joel, decides to leave the safety of the colony to travel 80 miles in order to reunite with his girlfriend. Along the way, he meets a cast of unusual characters that try to help him and monsters that try to kill him. Can Joel reunite with his girlfriend, or will he eventually get eaten by monsters along the way? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, starting with the premise, like I mentioned before, when I first heard the plot synopsis to this movie, I cringed because I thought this entire movie was going to play out like Warm Bodies, in which it's a post-apocalyptic movie with a really bad, cheesy love story. Thankfully, the movie isn't that. While it definitely is a post-apocalyptic movie, just replace the zombies with mutated animals, the actual story is a coming-of-age adventure. Sure, the premise of the movie itself definitely falls into the category of it's not about the destination for the main character, it's about the journey, which is nothing really new for a movie like this, or really any movie ever. But the fact that that's the type of movie we ended up getting was at least a pleasant surprise to me, and I think was the right call, as opposed to what I was expecting, which was essentially a forced rom-com with the occasional monster interaction. But thankfully, the movie doesn't go in that direction and sticks with the coming-of-age story with an adventure, which I think works greatly for the movie. I also think that the movie is very well paced for the most part. Sure, I do think that the first 20 minutes are a tad bit slow going because, much like our main character Joel, the audience itself is stuck within this dark and dreary bunker. But once Joel sets out on his adventure, the pacing of the movie does greatly improve and stay consistently steady throughout the runtime of the movie. I also love just how truly bleak this movie is, because when you look at the advertising to this movie, it's presented as being this upbeat, comical creature feature, and for the most part, it definitely is a very light-hearted movie in some areas, but when you really look at the reality in which these characters live in, it's really dark. For starters, the opening narration state that within 1 year of these creatures mutating into giant monsters, 95% of mankind has been wiped off the face of the earth, forcing the remaining 5% to hide in underground bunkers. And going back to the first 20 minutes of the movie, even though the first 20 minutes, as I mentioned earlier, are a tad bit slow going, it does set a picture of what life is like to live within these bunkers, as we see Joel give a narration about what he does day in, day out within the confines of his bunker for the past 7 years. And it really does paint a picture of just how grim their situation is, given that Joel and his colony never leave the bunker within the those 7 years. Unless if it's to get food, but other than that, they're in a pretty grim situation. There's even a few deleted scenes that really do a good job of showcasing the social life within Joel's colony by having Joel interact with various members of the bunker. And we basically get to see how they view their current outlook, and most of them are wondering, what's the point of living anymore? Can we even survive this? And when we do eventually see Joel leave the bunker and meet certain characters ranging from the dog or Michael Rooker's character along with his sidekick, and we are either shown or told about how these characters had someone that meant a lot to them, but at some point they either got killed or eaten by one of these giant monsters. And sometime later in the movie, we see Joel having a flashback to this one particular invasion in which we see him witnessing the death of his parents. And for a movie that's presented predominantly as this upbeat creature feature, it's surprisingly dark and gets darker the more I think about it. I also think that the acting is really good and that the actors in question give the appropriate performance for the character in which they are playing. But of all the actors and characters that appear in this movie, the biggest highlight has to go to the dog that plays Boy in the movie, for the simple reason that although this character is not human, it never physically talks, you get a sense of this dog's personality through the way it interacts with Joel and some of the other human characters, along with the way the cinematography frames itself with the dog. And you understand what this dog is thinking through visuals without any narration or lines of dialogue, which is super impressive. And while on the subject of non-human characters, the monsters in question, although they are just giant-sized version of cold-blooded animals, I think are very well designed, with the exception of one which I'll talk about later. But even then, you do get a sense of what these creatures are like through the way they're designed and the way they interact with our main characters, with my favorite being the giant centipede that Joel and Boy encounter sometime after they part ways with Michael Rooker's character, because on top of it having a very cool looking design, and the reason as to why I gravitated towards this particular creature as opposed to any other creature, as someone who watches a ton of B movies, especially that of the creature feature variety, I find centipedes to be the most underutilized on that front, because when you look at any creature feature, most of them are about killer spiders, sharks, crocodiles, snakes, any other bug, and the occasional killer bird movie, but none about centipedes. So I do appreciate that here's a big, high-budget creature feature in which it features a giant centipede in it. And while I'm thinking about it, I also do love the fact that one of the other monsters in the movie is a giant frog, but I'm not talking about the frog, I'm talking about the centipede. Anywho, and on top of that, the way it interacts with both Joel and Boy is super unsettling, where it starts making this humming noise, then it's revealed that it's able to camouflage with its surroundings. And I also love how it uses its antenna to feel out Joel to get a sense of how dangerous he is, to see whether or not he's a threat. And on top of that, the scene with the centipede is super important for Joel's development moving forward. And that's another thing I also loved about these scenes, because anytime we see Joel encounter any of these monsters, they're not just there to provide an obstacle for our main character, they serve a purpose. Regardless if we're being introduced to a new character, learning new concepts that'll play an important part later in the movie, or simply having an emotional moment that ties in with character development. Because unlike a movie such as Kong Skull Island, in which we have all these scenes in which we see our cast of human characters interacting with these monsters, they ultimately are just there to provide an obstacle and don't really serve a big purpose. With this movie, on the other hand, there's a purpose and reason as to why these encounters happen from a emotional and narrative developmental standpoint. I also love the various references to other creature features that are sprinkled throughout the movie, from a newspaper clipping that we see at the beginning of the movie that says President of the United States was killed by a giant moth, in reference to Mothra of the Godzilla franchise, along with the climax of the movie in which we see Joel and a few other characters battling this giant crab, which is meant to reference the 1961 movie adaptation of Mysterious Island, in which the special effects were done by Ray Harryhausen for the one scene in the movie in which we see our main characters battling this giant crab, in which Harryhausen supposedly used a real crab shell for the scene. But anywho, there's a few other references to other creature features, but those were the two big ones that came to mind. I also love the opening prologue to this movie, which is done in this cartoony art style that's done by Joel. And it's one of those things where we don't just see it in this opening prologue, but I also love how we do continue to see that art style throughout the movie, as we see Joel periodically write in drawing the various monsters he encounters on his journey, and seeing the results of those illustrations appear during the closing credits of the movie. I also think the movie has some good production values, from having really good cinematography to the CGI being very well done. And one thing that surprised me about the special effects in general was that for one scene that occurs near the beginning of the movie, we had a practical effect, because I was just expecting all the monsters in this movie to be depicted using CGI, and for 98% of the time they are CGI. But there was a moment where one of the creatures was depicted using a practical effect, which I thought was a pleasant surprise, and I do appreciate a modern Hollywood movie utilizing both practical effects and CGI to make a movie more believable, even if it is for just a few seconds. Now we move on to the part of the review in which I discuss aspects, or in this case, an aspect of the movie that I had mixed feelings about. That revolving around Michael Rooker's character, because on the one hand, when he does show up within the movie, he's really awesome. But the thing is, he has very limited screen time, which to some people might be disappointing. For example, when you look at the movie poster or the trailers and TV spots, they predominantly feature Michael Rooker as if he's gonna be a major part of the movie and is gonna be a character that appears throughout the entire thing. Yet when you watch the movie, he only appears in it for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then he just disappears, not to be seen again until the last 10 seconds of the movie. However, that being said, I think what the filmmakers do with Michael Rooker's character within those 10 to 15 minutes of the movie do play a significant part within both the development of Joel and the movie moving forward. And the way the filmmakers utilize Michael Rooker's character to do this is by having him teach Joel how to survive on the surface, essentially giving him the knowledge to survive the remainder of the movie. So basically the takeaway is that Michael Rooker has very limited screen time, but what he does with that limited screen time is important. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, honestly, I don't really have that many problems with the movie. And the first problem I have, honestly, isn't really the biggest problem, it's more of a nitpick. That being the book Joel carries throughout the movie, in which we see him constantly draw pictures and update the book as he goes. And sometime after he kills the Queen Sand Gobbler, we see that his bag is in the river with his book inside of it. And you expect his book to get some water damage. Yet when he arrives to Aimee's colony, we see him pull the book out, and not only is it completely dry, but it doesn't have any signs of water damage whatsoever. I know that this isn't the most important detail within the movie, but I wish that when Joel pulls the book out before the climax to look at it, I wish that maybe there was some water damage to show consistency within the movie. Although I just find it weird that the book is dry and not water damaged despite it clearly going through a river. But anywho, moving on to the first actual problem that I have with the movie has to do with the dog and its relationship to the monsters. Because of the handful of monsters that Joel encounters throughout the whole movie, 2 of them try to kill the dog, but the rest don't. And I don't understand why the rest of them don't try to kill the dog as opposed to the 2 that do. And let me give you 2 different examples. The first example being when we first see the dog rescuing Joel from the giant frog monster. Because there's a moment where the dog runs up to the frog monster, starts barking at it, stepping closer to the giant frog, which results in the giant frog being surprised by the dog. And you would think because this giant frog is hungry, it would go after the dog first because it's the closer target as opposed to Joel, who's far away. Yet the frog goes after Joel and not the dog. And that's essentially how most of the interactions between the mutated animals and the dog go. Sure, you had some other monsters like the giant centipede and the queen sand gobbler trying to go after the dog, but other than that, most of the mutated animals seem to leave the dog alone, and I don't understand why. I wish this was expanded upon, or if there was some natural explanation behind it. As it is, I don't understand it. And let me give you an example. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with the Mavis robot. For the simple reason that, why was this robot a big deal? Because at the beginning of the movie, it's established that these robots existed at one point, and our main character finds one that's alive and well, and there's some dialogue he gives which implies that these Mavis robots were supposed to be the next big thing, and later in the movie when he tells his colony that he encountered a working Mavis robot, they were surprised by it. This just brings up a ton of questions. How were these Mavis robots supposed to be the next big deal? Why were they supposed to be a big deal? It just feels like this movie had a very big lack of world building in some shape or form, because even though I think that scene where Joel meets that working Mavis robot was very emotional and sweet, I just wanted more information in regards to why this robot existed in the first place. And for the last problem that I have with the movie has to do with the last third of the movie itself. Everything from a world building perspective and the climax, and the monster associated with the climax. Because I get what the last third was trying to establish from a world building perspective, in that sense where it's saying the mutated animals aren't the only monsters out there. People too can be monsters as well. And I think it's really cool to see a group of humans utilizing one of these mutated monsters to do their bidding, but there's just no build up to it, and it just comes straight out of nowhere. I mean, one could make the argument that the reoccurring joke of having Joel meet all these different people and they ask Joel, why is he doing out of the bunker? Did he steal some food? To maybe be foreshadowing for the climax, but if it is, it's poorly done. Then you have the giant crab monster, and I think the crab monster, in regards to the texture of its shell, looks great, but the face that the filmmakers give to this particular giant crab looks so cartoony, to a point that I'm convinced this giant crab came from an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, as opposed to this movie. Personally, this is how I would have handled the last third. First off, think back to that one scene where we see Joel target practicing and Michael Rooker's character scouting. Because there's a point in time where he says, well, we better get a move on because I just spotted us a giant monster and it's caught Joel's scent. This would be the basis for the climax, because the first time I saw the movie, I thought this was a setup to the climax. But as the movie progressed, this plot point was just dropped in favor of that out of nowhere climax with the pirates. So what I would have done is maybe when we see Joel finally reach the colony where Aimee is, maybe we cut back periodically to locations where Joel has already been, with that one particular monster making its way closer towards Joel. At some point, maybe we see Boy, the dog, just wandering around. It catches a whiff of this thing, knowing that it's been following them, and then tries to find Joel. And when it does, it tries to warn Joel and Aimee about that monster, which leads into this climax, which revolves around Joel, Aimee, Boy, and Aimee's colony set up a trap to kill this giant monster that's been slowly chasing Joel. I think that would have been a much better climax than what we got with the pirates and the giant crab. Another problem that I have with the movie, the problem in question is more of a disappointment, in that sense where here's a movie that's essentially a high-budget creature feature, and I was kind of hoping there would have been a point in time where we would have seen like two different creatures fight against one another. Not sure what the context would be behind it, but I think it would have been very neat to see like what giant-sized animals would fight one another. Sure, this movie technically doesn't need a giant monster fight scene, but I think it would have been awesome if it did have one. So for my final verdict of Love and Monsters, honestly, this movie is a lot better than it should be, considering that I was expecting this movie to basically be Warm Bodies all over again, but upon watching the movie, it was a lot better than it should have been. I mean, on pen and paper, this should not have worked, but it somehow worked. I mean, the casting's great, the special effects are very well done, and the scenes of the monsters themselves actually do serve a purpose other than just being an obstacle for our main characters. And despite the movie's upbeat nature, it is surprisingly bleak, which I was not expecting. Sure, I do have a lot of problems with the last third of the movie in some areas, but overall, Love and Monsters is a great creature feature that has a surprising amount of heart to it. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Love and Monsters? So it looks like the movie got generally good reception, and so for my final rating of Love and Monsters, I give it a 4 out of 5. So what is your favorite creature feature? And see you later.